afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Portland Children's Levy Allocation Meeting. I'm Ted Wheeler. I'm the mayor of the city of Portland and the chair of the Allocation Committee. I'd like to introduce my colleagues on the committee. Of course, we have Multnomah County Commissioner Jessica Vega-Peterson, and on my right is Mitch Harnaker. He's the business community representative. And it's my understanding Julie Young will not be with us today, and Felicia will be here shortly, is my understanding. We, of course, have the entire Children's Levy staff here: Lisa Pellegrino, Meg McElroy, Lisa Hansel, Mary Gay Broderick, John Coughlin, and John Kelly. We thank them for their continued excellent service. And before we get started, I'd like to entertain a motion for the approval of the April 8th minutes.
So moved.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor vote aye.
Aye.
Opposed, hearing none, the minutes are approved, which is always an exciting part of our meeting.
Really starting off hot.
Next, we have time for public comment. As per usual, this is for public comment on items that are not actually on the agenda. This is just a reminder that we have time for public comment at 4 different times later in the meeting. Before we act on the small grants fund proposal, at 2 points after our discussion on proposed changes in the upcoming request for investment, and last but not least after a presentation on the potential changes to public testimony for the next funding round. So is there anybody who'd like to speak today on items that are not on the agenda? Don't all bully yourselves over getting to the microphones. Very good. Up first then on the agenda is the small grants fund proposal. Lisa is going to lead us through a discussion, and then again we'll hear public comment on this item, and then we'll decide how or if we want to move forward on this plan. Good afternoon, Lisa. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. Okay, just to refresh our memory, our collective memory on the small grants fund proposal. So this is something that PSU recommended that we do to improve equity of access to levy funding for smaller organizations that are not successfully able to compete for larger grants, to fund organizations that arise out of communities, and to reach children and families that may not be served in the currently funded organizations, and to build capacity in smaller organizations that serve children and families. So that was the sort of rationale behind their recommendation. We put together some parameters, proposed parameters, to ask you all to think about, and also to go out and test again, because PSU just advised fairly generally what to do. So we put a little bit of shape around what that might look like, and then asked people to react to it. So just kind of to refresh everybody's memory, we were positing having a fund of $1 to $1.5 million, a grant size of less than, it had to be at least less than 60,000, since that's a minimum we'll recommend for the regular round. The rules around what PCL can fund, we can't be more than 30% of somebody's revenues, would remain the same. We have to fund programs in the 6 program areas, that's in the legal requirements, and then they would be for about a maximum of 3 years by the time we would be able to get the fund off the ground. So the target number for grants, again, is going to depend on the length and the size of the grants, but somewhere in that range of 10 to 20. And then the types of organizations and service populations we're thinking about are an organization that has some paid staff and receives funding from other sources to make up that 30%, so they can make sure they can meet this 30% requirement. And then that organizations that are looking to develop greater capacity to be able to serve their communities, and those that are developed out of the communities that they're serving, so closer to the grassroots. So that's kind of the basic parameters that we asked people to react to. We sent out just a brief survey that said, are you a thumbs up or a thumbs down on this idea? And if you like it, what are you excited about? And if you are concerned, what are your concerns? We only got 20 folks who responded to it, or 19 folks, I think, who responded to the survey, so that was not a resounding additional input, but I would say that only one person was not in favor of it, so it was basically positive further feedback. The concerns were all grouped around sort of a few different things. A number of folks noted that there's a need for the current grantees agencies to receive more funding. Those folks are always looking for more funding to do their work as well. Some people had concerns about staff capacity to do it. Some folks asked whether PCL resources were adequate to support such a fund. They sort of wanted to know what the overall level of funding was. And then some people noted that smaller organizations might need a higher admin rate than we typically allow. Our admin cap for organizations delivering services is currently 15%. So I wanted to, I think a number of these things can be dealt with, by who would ever develop the fund. So the admin rates, those kind of things could be set further down the line. And I think need to be set in conjunction with talking to the kinds of organizations that would be applying potentially for these grants. I can clarify that PCL is projected to have adequate resources to be able to keep the current investment level, which is about $19 million in grants currently, to create a small grants fund of the size we have put forth, and would still have some additional resources to add to the competitive funding round that will be upcoming in September. And that is due to increased revenues over what what has been projected in previous levy years. And also there is some accrued fund balance because we had additional revenues were higher than projected when we made the grants, and even despite making more grants and additional grants to use some of those additional revenues, there's still some left over. So we will spread those out across the remaining years of the current levy. So there would be adequate revenue, as this is a sort of a short way of saying, hi, Felicia. Welcome. Thank you. I know it's always hard to get downtown, and parking is a misery. So, and as we mentioned before, we would be recommending to hire an additional person to do this work. I don't think that there is adequate, I think the person questioning staff capacity, I don't think we would have capacity to do the work, and especially with the issues that PSU noted of additional time and help from staff needed by organizations who would apply for this. So with that, I would say staff is still recommending that we move forward with this. We didn't receive any really big negative input toward it, and I think it was a well thought out recommendation of PSU and sort of reflected a resounding input they heard when they went around talking to all the folks they consulted for that qualitative study. So that's a staff recommendation. I guess at this point I would want to turn it over to your discussion, whether folks have any additional questions or clarifications they would want, and whether they want to move forward.
I have a couple questions.
Sure,
Thank
go
you.
for it.
So the first of all, the word that was used in the memo was hiring a person to pilot a small grants fund within the parameters. What did you mean by the word pilot? What does that look like? Is it a temporary in terms of length of time?
I think that we were proposing that you would try a small grants fund, and then look at the results and to see whether it achieved those purposes that, we were making this recommendation to move forward based on the rationale at PSU, or address the kinds of concerns they mentioned. And we just would, I think, want to look back and make sure that we did a good job of that. Did the small grants fund address these concerns and issues in a way that was effective?
Would it be for the 5 years length of the grant funding?
Well, we're going to be a year in,
Okay,
right? So the
before.
new levy starts in July, and we got to hire somebody, so that always takes some amount of time, and then that person has got to, I think, work with the community to figure out how to structure this exactly. These are pretty basic parameters. They would need more process, and you all would need to be called together to decide those things as that person move forward. So I don't think that grants would be made out of that fund. So they have to set it up, they got to decide, you all have to agree on what it's going to look like, and then they have to carry out the funding round, however long that takes. And if people need extra time for application, more support, all of those phases could potentially be longer if that's what's called for. So I think that part has got to get worked out. So I think the actual grant length, we were imagining the grants would begin in like January 21 maybe, possibly slightly later, depending on how long their process was to roll out and what it looked like. So it would be 3 years for sure. Possibly that would give you a chance to come back and look at it and decide if it accomplished what you wanted to accomplish and possibly modify it.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And then I may have asked this question before, but do we have any idea how many applicants we may be getting just based on maybe who didn't apply to previously or what we've heard from community? I mean, obviously in the responses, they said like 4 of the 19 survey respondents would potentially. But
I think it's going to depend on how you set the parameters exactly. So we know lower than 60, but that's still, I mean, it could be, you could have it between a certain kind of range. It could be 20 to 50. If you fund a lot of very tiny grants, which I think we would not recommend, but if you did that, then you would have more applicants because people have still got to be able to do city contracting. They have to carry insurance. They have to have some staff. I mean, there's some requirements that would be there that need to be met. I mean, there are other city bureaus who let small grants. So I know it is doable and possible. I just, the number I think it's going to depend on how you structure it.
Okay, thank you.
Do folks have other discussion or question? Do you want to see if anybody wants to testify?
Any public testimony on this item?
resounding
Could you just
silence.
give me one clarification on the timeline? So your staff recommendation would be that we try this as a pilot. What is the time period you're recommending?
A 3-year, I mean, for the grants to be in effect over 3 years' time.
And does that give us
Process
sufficient-
running up to it.
In your opinion, Lisa, that's sufficient time to be able to evaluate whether it's a
think so,
success
yeah.
or not? Okay.
We do our renewals after 3 years. I mean, that gives us a good sense. You get a couple years of data. You can also help build capacity so people are tracking data. And I think that's one of the things we want to try to address, is to help people be able to do that.
And do you have a sense that, I mean, obviously there'll be administrative efforts associated with this, probably some technical assistance, and that's worked into this already?
Yeah, I would think the staff person is going to, I mean, again, it depends on who you get, what staff person you hire and what their skill set is. So some technical assistance could likely be provided by the staff person. Some might have to be hired out. It would depend on what would be needed, I think.
And the increased administrative support or technical assistance, in your opinion, will be outweighed by the benefit of attracting different providers who have more direct connections to communities we're not currently reaching? Is that your assumption?
Well, that's the idea, yes, and to help develop other organizations that are serving segments of communities, because communities are broader than just any one organization serves. I mean, for instance, we fund only one organization in town that serves Native Americans. There may well be others that are smaller, and maybe reaching segments of the Native American community that are not being reached by NAB just because they're dispersed. I mean, there's just, I think we don't know what we don't know.
What would you say to those who might be concerned, me being one of them? I'll just be honest. I think we should do this, but I think we should go into this with our eyes wide open, and we should be very, very transparent that if we go into this and we fund very small organizations for 3 years, it's highly likely that we will become large financial supporters of those operations, or is that not the case?
Well, if you keep that 30% rule, then at least we're making sure we're no more than a third of their revenues, if
Okay,
you will,
and is
for a
it the
year.
intention then to keep the 30%
Well, that's in the law,
rule?
so we have to do that. That's in the law that governs the children's levy.
Okay, because
So-
my concern is we get to the end of 3 years and we have a lot of people saying, if you pull the rug out from under us, we will collapse. And
Well, I
so I just want to make
suppose
sure
that's-
we're
I mean-
going, because I don't know how many times in 12 years I've heard that, where we do a pilot program or we offer a grant with a limited term duration, and then we get lots and lots of advocacy saying, if you pull this grant or you don't continue supporting it, you're killing the organization and all of the work that we do.
Well, you would have the option of continuing the grants if you felt they were effective and this was a good idea. I mean, you don't necessarily have to sunset them. I think that we wouldn't want to promise we were going to do it more than 3 years to start, because I think you do have to have some chance to reflect on what happened and what you got out of the process, whether you feel like it was a worthwhile way to meet these goals. So I think, yes, you wouldn't necessarily have to decide for sure ahead of time that you would cancel everything after 3 years. You could entertain that at that moment.
Do we have an expectation that we will be clear on what outcomes we're expecting to derive by the end of 3 years?
Well, I think we would be looking to meet some of these, higher level outcomes, and we always ask programs to be thinking about what outcomes they're trying to achieve, and we always look at, how they do that. So we would be able to give you some kind of assessment of how they have performed on their grants, and that's one portion of what we do for any grant. But I think these other things are, improving equity of access, trying to help build capacity in a band of organizations that is trying to serve particular communities and have risen up out of those communities is another goal. It's a different policy goal. So yes, I think that outcome is measurable.
Great,
and
thank
we
you.
can
I
give you
appreciate it.
feedback on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are great questions. And it's going to come down to what we write up as, what's our scoring mechanisms going to be. And to the mayor's point, there's a little tension between the idea of building capacity so these organizations can grow and stand on their own, with the concept of funding terms longer than a short period of time. So I would, and while you're correct that our revenue is growing, it's true every dollar we're spending to grow organizations' backbones is dollars that we're not spending on direct services. So I think we always have to be, I always try to be reflective of that. So I think how we write it up is going to be important, and I would hope that that's a participatory process as we go along. And we can kind of think about things, do we want to say you can only get 1 3-year grant, and after that, our goal for building is long, or is that going to be counterintuitive to reaching kids that we haven't reached before? So
I think those are the questions that you're
yeah,
going to, you no doubt will have to wrestle with those questions. I don't mean that you won't have to, but I think that those will be questions, and they're not answerable probably yet. And I think there's also, there are funders out there who decrease funding over time and try to help the organization build their fundraising capacity too. So there's other options in there that we haven't really explored at this level. I don't think it makes sense to yet. You will have the chance to consider that as we build it and decide how you want to kind of balance those policy goals, because I think you're right, they're competing to some extent.
Great. Does that complete your presentation?
That completes presentation.
Is there public testimony on this? All right, what's your will on this?
do we need a vote to approve going further?
Yeah, I think we would need a vote that you want to move forward with this project and authorize us to move forward with hiring a person, because that'll be the first step in moving forward.
All right, I'll entertain a motion.
I move that we move forward with directing staff to begin the process of starting a small grants fund.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second from Felicia. Please, well, I guess I get to call the roll. All in favor, vote aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All right, good luck.
Thanks.
Wish you the very best.
Yes.
All right, next, Lisa Meg, and the other Lisa, Lisa Hansel, will present the draft program area service strategies that will be included in the RFI for the upcoming levy funding round. After any questions that we have up here, we'll of course open this up to any public comment that people might have, and then provide some direction to staff in preparation for their return next month with presumably a second or an updated draft. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'll get us started here. So I'll provide some background and context, and then each of the staff members will present draft strategies. Up on the slide, you'll see the goals that were adopted for the levy before the 2014 competitive funding round. The goals are prepare children for school, support children's success inside and outside of school, and reduce racial and ethnic disparities in children's well-being and school success. Program area goals are in your materials and also in the handout for the audience. Prior to new funding rounds, the levy seeks community input about the most needed services in each of the levy's 6 funding areas. Community engagement for this upcoming funding round differed from previous community engagement in that it focused on engaging a more diverse range of community members instead of focused on service providers and stakeholders as was done in the past. Community members provided input on preferred services in each of the program areas, service qualities and features, how services are delivered, and who delivers services. At the last allocation committee meeting, we heard from the Empress Rules team, who presented the community engagement report, and that report is available on the Levy website. The next slide up on the screen shows the recommendations that are included in the report. They, at a high level, they focused on equity and inclusion and demonstrate a preference for services that are culturally relevant, responsive, and focused, and trauma-informed. They listen to the voices and preferences of youth and families served. They pay attention to accessibility, especially around hours of service, transportation, and location, and employ staff who are from the cultural communities that are served. In drafting the program area strategies, staff relied heavily on the input that was received through the community engagement process about these themes, as well as preferred service strategies and preferred services. Staff also considered local data compiled in 2018, relevant research, and national, state, and local frameworks. Today, staff will present the first draft of strategies for each of the program areas. The committee will have the opportunity to ask questions, discuss, and hear public input. The draft program strategies were provided to the community or to the allocation committee in advance of the meeting and was also distributed through the PCL database. And hard copies are available in your packets and also for the members of the audience today, and will also be available on the PCL website after this meeting. The strategy documents include features, strategies, possible service approaches, rationale, and citations to everything that we considered when we were developing the strategies. Staff will present the strategies by program area in the order that they appear in the document, and I guess check for questions. Anything? Questions? If no questions, then I'll turn it over to Meg to start with early childhood.
All right.
Hi, Mike.
Hi. So the early childhood strategies, if Lisa will drive
Yes.
the machine here, are shown here on the slide. And everyone who is in attendance today has a document that outlines what you all received as well, which is for each program area, the full information that Lisa just described. So for the early childhood program strategies, the 3 strategies are listed there. And the key features that would be sought for services in this area would be experience, intentionality, and success supporting child development and school readiness of children of color and other historically underserved populations, such as children with disabilities, children of immigrant and refugee families, and families experiencing housing stability. And you'll hear that kind of a feature across all the program areas because that was one of the leading themes from our community engagement process. Other things that came up that were out of community engagement that are very particular to early childhood and that are features that we want to see in the types of applications and strategies that we support are parent voice and leadership in identifying the needs and solutions to meet their needs, that the projects proposed are informed by the science of brain development and child development, that they create connection and community between parents, that they help connect parents and families to resources for basic need, including for transportation to services, and that the workforce reflects the community and culture of the families being served, including being offered and done in the home language of the family being served. Like I said, the 3 strategies are provided there. They are to provide affordable, high-quality preschool programs, and that included a focus on small child-to-adult ratios and focused on quality standards, enhancing parent and family support of child development and nurturing, and support families and childcare providers and teachers with guiding child behavior. In addition to the features for those strategies, the rationale from community engagement drove those, as we said, local data, and then the research in the current early childhood field and several policy frameworks that point to this array of service, these types of services, and many of the features that came through in our community engagement process. So we are going to keep each presentation roughly that brief. If you want to ask a program area specific question before I transition it over to Lisa for the next program area, I'm happy to answer it. Or if you want to save them all for the end, we could do it that way too. We'll keep going.
I don't see any burning questions, but.
Okay, next, Lisa, can you change to child abuse prevention,
Yes.
please? Thank you.
Not bad slide projector person.
So the features in the child abuse prevention intervention program area that are being sought or proposed to be sought are culturally relevant, responsive, and focused, just like we said through all the areas. The specific things in child abuse prevention: experience serving children and families exposed to toxic stress or trauma, including African American and Native American children and families, immigrant children and families, and children with disabilities. Important to offer accessible services, including flexible hours and transportation, and ongoing training for staff in cultural inclusivity, racial equity, and trauma-informed practices. 3 strategies were outlined based on the community input. The first being enhanced parenting skills to promote healthy child development. and with possible service approaches like home visiting services that provide parenting information and caregiver support. Another possible approach would be parenting skill and family relationship approaches, focusing on positive parenting practices and creating safe environments for children. And providing parenting education support was highlighted in all three levels of community, all three strands of community input. The second strategy would be to intervene to lessen harms and prevent future risk with a real focus on healing. And so more of a prevention/intervention approach. And possible approaches would be behavioral parent training programs and treatment and other kinds of approaches, working with families to lessen harms and also to prevent future violence later in life. One thing I just do want to mention on this one is that treatment and other healing approaches would be limited to services that are not eligible for coverage through Medicaid or other insurance. And applicants could propose to enhance existing services or to cover programmatic expenses that are not covered through insurance or Medicaid. And providing mental health therapy and counseling was another item that was highlighted through all strands of community input. And the third strategy in this program area is to connect families to needed resources and support for stabilization. This, again, was something heard through all levels of community input. And possible service approaches would be case management or navigation services, really working with families to help connect them to resources in the community to meet their basic needs. For example, housing, medical care, job training, respite services. The list goes on, whatever families need to be stabilized and keep their kids safe.
Can I ask you a question there?
Sure.
From the service provider perspective, and I totally get why families would find it very difficult to navigate what's a fairly fragmented system in terms of service delivery and supports. But from the provider perspective, is there enough capacity even if we had a good navigation model in place? I mean, is there an assumption on the part of the public that if we could only direct them to the right service, there would be room for them in that service?
Well, yeah, I mean, we don't know that would happen, but first people need to know what services are available. One of the things in community input that came up a lot was that folks don't even know what resources are available in the community to help meet the needs that they do have. And so I think the first step is understanding what people's needs are and connecting them to resources that are available. And we do know that there obviously are shortages in the community for different resources. I think, part of what we can do is help to understand where those gaps are. I mean, we can't necessarily fill those gaps
Have
with
we
levy funding.
provided a comprehensive guide of what those services are? Like, have we ever put online or published, do we actually have a comprehensive list?
Wouldn't that be 211?
Well, presumably it would be.
Yeah, I mean,
I think it's also important to keep in mind that those things change. What eligibility criteria, where a service is provided, which provider is offering it is subject to change based on how funding streams do and don't contract for those services over time. So 211 has been primarily the keeper of that information, and because they do it in a digital and online format, they have the highest probability of having it be accurate over time, but it's also only as accurate as the provider makes updates to that system.
So I'll cop a plea here and admit it's been a while since I've actually looked at the 211 system in any depth. Would it be possible for a future meeting to get a 15 or 20-minute presentation on 211, just so we have a sense of how our services are connecting with 211?
Ours as in the levies or ours as in the collective communities services?
I would actually be interested in both.
Okay.
How the levy fits in, but collectively what the city, what the county, what other service providers are providing. What is our current level of baselining the services that are available, and how accessible is that information to the public at large?
I think another.
I've just been out of that.
Yeah,
loop for a while.
all important and great questions, and I think with a lot of providers sitting in this room, it might also be worth, if we have time in this meeting, to ask them some impressions about how they feel that navigation path is or isn't working, because they're the ones handling it in two directions. They are both referring families they're working with out to things, and they are accepting referrals in from others. And so I feel like the experts in this room would be the ones I would want to ask that question to, in addition to trying to understand how 211 sort of
Great.
manages its information. But I feel like there's a lot of collective wisdom here.
Yeah, good, excellent. Love to hear what they have to say.
Okay. Do you want to hold that and?
Yeah, I'll
put-
hold it till we get to public testimony, and maybe somebody here who has more familiarity than me, which is probably just about everybody sitting in the room. I'd love to get your perspectives.
Okay, now where was I? Okay, and then the next service approach would be to, for having a pool of client assistance funds to meet basic needs for families on a short-term basis. And with that service approach, that would need to be tied to at least one other proposed service approach, either related to this strategy or another child abuse prevention intervention strategy. Connecting to family, like I said, this was something that came up. Connecting to families to needed resources was identified by community survey respondents as a top service need when child neglect is a concern. And service providers said this was not being able to connect with needed services is something that gets in the way of preventing child abuse and neglect.
Kind of to your point. So it's both and. It's making sure we have adequate connection services and making sure we provide some support. I mean, I don't think we can solve the housing crisis with,
Right.
the Children's Levy funds, and that's a huge issue, without a doubt, for family instability. But there are some folks in situations where you can help. And so it's trying to make something available for, no, we can't build another housing complex on our own for sure, but we could maybe figure out how to stabilize your rent where you are. Those kind of things.
And it's something that can really help keep children out of the child welfare system. I mean, it's something that child welfare managers say that, if you can't get housing, you need to have your basic needs. You need to be meeting the basic needs of your children in order to provide a safe environment for them. And so one of the ways to help families keep their children and keep them out of child welfare is to help make sure that their basic needs are being met.
Right, and this is a perfect example that you've raised, actually, because last year the city and the county jointly supported 750 people remaining in their housing. These were people identified as being very high risk of becoming homeless. But I'm not entirely clear how that system seamlessly integrates with this system.
I would doubt it
I'm not
was
saying
seamless.
it doesn't, I'm just not aware of it.
It kind of depends on how families make their way to a service provider. So, I mean, I think that's a piece of, what door do they go through and how do their problems, get solved? So it may be that families who are struggling for one reason or another enter through a door that it leads right to the joint office.
Right,
It may be that they enter through a different door and don't necessarily, nobody points them to those resources.
And this is the problem we have at the city of Portland, is we expect people to enter from the bottom of the funnel. And we make them pick the stream of service rather than having it all come from one place. We don't have a 311 system in the city of Portland. We're one of the last major metropolitan areas in the United States to not have one. So instead, we have hundreds and hundreds of voicemails, most of which, by the way, are never serviced. And so I'm just trying to figure out how all of these pieces fit together. It's not a curiosity, because my suspicion is we're wasting a lot of resource and a lot of people are falling through the cracks. But hopefully some of the people in the room will tell me that's not the case.
I don't know that resources necessarily being wasted, but if you had, only one funder, then it would be easier to solve the problem.
Well, if you have a family that has 2 or 3 different service needs and they're only getting one, then you may not be as effectively as possible integrating or supporting or investing in that one service. If it takes 2 others to make it successful for the family and they're only getting the one, then I would argue, yeah, you've actually wasted the resources that went into the one. If it takes 3 to make it successful. It's an old math problem.
Yeah.
but-
It depends on the constellation of things, I guess,
Okay.
so.
Well, again, I'm just curious.
This is a bit off topic, but I actually think that this is one of those things where better data information sharing systems actually could go a long way towards helping people not just navigate, but also service providers tracking where people are in the system and how they're being touched. And this is like a little off topic from what we're talking about. It is something that, we're trying to do at the county, is making sure that we're connecting even within ours, but then how that relates to the state or what the city or service providers are doing. It's like, it's an ongoing conversation and needs more investment.
It's the jurisdictions that seem to cause the most, it's the jurisdictions that have sets of services and funding. And if you don't eliminate jurisdiction, it's very difficult to get to the result that you want. And so I don't know how to get, I wish I knew how to get there. But those jurisdictions still live with us. So how do we, it's like people are paying for the sets of things that they're paying for that are in line with their public mission. And so I don't know how you stop that and do something different. I don't have a master plan. But I do feel like we've heard service providers as well as communities say that the ability to try to prevent what is an emergency into becoming a catastrophe is something that is needed. And there are some families for whom that would be helpful. And the point is, can the service providers get funded to find them and help them? So that's kind of where we landed with trying to deal with that need.
Way to bring it back.
Any questions about child abuse prevention intervention? Any additional? Ready to move foster care? Okay. So in foster care, the features that we're looking for would be similar to the other program areas we've discussed, with the addition of experience serving children and youth in foster care, including African American and Native American youth who identify as LGBTQ+, older youth, youth with disabilities, and youth with behavior challenges. Additionally, we'd be looking for programs and organizations who have established working relationships with DHS Child Welfare, that they understand the child welfare system and can successfully support parents and youth and foster parents in navigating that system. And then offering accessible and flexible hours, including evenings and weekends, and again, ongoing staff training. So in this program area, 2 strategies are proposed: enhanced support and training for foster parents to promote healthy child development. Some service approaches in here would be similar to those that you heard in child abuse prevention for birth parents. In-home visits to provide service to children and support foster parents with skills and education training to help address the individual needs of the children in their care. Facilitate the support of partnering relationships between birth parents and foster parents, and provide other kinds of supports like respite and child care and grief support for foster families when children leave their homes. Providing support and training for foster parents was identified as a critical need by all 3, through the community service providers and focus groups. And staff also met with DHS District 2 Child Welfare Management teams to get their input on the needs and priorities for children and youth in foster care, to make sure that the strategies and possible service approaches were appropriate for children in DHS custody, and that they were appropriately provided by community-based services. And they too identified the need of supporting and training foster parents as very important. So that's the first one, and the second strategy was really around individualized support to promote child and youth well-being. And this is a really pretty broad strategy, including things like mentoring, providing youth with a consistent adult relationship that could help, have that consistent relationship and also model important life skills. And another example would be support and guiding youth in that transition from foster care to adulthood. And also reunification support, assuring that children and birth parents receive visitations while the children are in foster care, and then parenting and intensive skill building when the families are reunified. And again, some of those same kinds of supports that you saw in the child abuse prevention intervention area. And then the last service approach in this area would be around advocacy and case management, more of a broad-based, whatever services and supports the youth in foster care need to meet their needs. And again, this was highlighted in the community engagement as well as conversations with DHS child welfare management teams. I know we want to move to the next one really quickly, but I do want to say that one thing that was highlighted in community engagement that is not included as a strategy is counseling, therapy, and support for youth in foster care, children and youth in foster care. Last time around, that came up as a need as well. And at that time, the allocation committee decided not to include it as a strategy because they really felt like that was a service that needed to be provided through OHP, because that's an entitlement for any child in foster care. And I discussed that with DHS district management as well, and they really did not advise the Levy investing that as well, that it really needed to be something worked in through that OHP system.
I have a question under this really quick, under the foster parents. Why isn't recruitment part of that, like encouraging, because there's such a shortage of especially families of color, and we constantly are hearing in the Oregonian that DHS workers are holding up these kids in hotels. Why isn't recruitment a priority as well? Because I understand support and training, but we have a shortage of foster parents. Why isn't that part of the priority?
Well, it certainly could be added to. I think that recruitment is primarily a DHS responsibility, but I think that through these community-based programs, there could be partnership with DHS to do that. So certainly could add that in there. Thank you. Other questions before we move to the next area?
All right, moving on to, oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I thought it was mentoring next.
Did I
I'm
mess that up?
happy to. Go ahead.
I think it was after school. Pardon me if I'm out of order. So in after school, the features that kind of ran through all programming that folks want to be sure would be funded, as we've said before, culturally relevant, responsive, and focused programming was at the top of the list. Also unique, or at least somewhat unique to after school, staff to student ratios that allow for individual attention and support for youth came up quite a bit. Providing transportation or somehow assuring that transportation is provided by another partner was another big piece that came up. So again, that we think that should be a feature. And then also as another area, staff training on cultural responsiveness, trauma-informed practice, and also in this area, youth development practice came up quite heavily in both focus group and provider responses. The strategies to address an after school are as follows. The first is academic support and tutoring that includes individual attention and staff who act as a liaison between school, parents, and caregivers. Or the idea of possible service approaches here could be things like academic goal setting or programs that include academic goal setting, homework support, academic skill building, credit recovery, advocating for students with school personnel, because that's a big issue, and also helping and supporting parents to be advocates for their children with school personnel and in school systems. So those are possible elements in the services for after school. The rationale, the need for academic support and tutoring was a theme across all strands of input that was resounding. And that need for staffing to support the communication piece between all the different pieces in that puzzle was a big theme in both the community survey and the provider survey. So I think that's where that arose from. There is great research and great local data supporting the need for more academic support. Our graduation rates alone in Oregon could be a reason why we should be supporting this in after school. And after school programs have had great results in supporting students to meet those goals. So that's the first strategy. Second is support healthy relationship building, positive behavior, and social emotional skill development. Service approaches there are things that include curriculum and activities that either embed a focus on these things or the program itself is focused on these elements. And the idea is that to focus on, when we say social emotional skill building, that's a little bit of a term of art. Those are things like cultural identity, belonging, interpersonal skills, goal setting, having a growth mindset, self-management, perseverance, engagement, self-efficacy, all these concepts that support your academic achievement and that sometimes people called soft skills. They've gone by lots of names, but they are clearly very important in kids' development, and that came through in all strands of input. And the other, I would say the skills these skills are important both for academic and life success, and after-school programs have been shown in research to have positively impact them. So that's the reason for that strategy. The third is providing engaging enrichment opportunities that are attractive to children and youth, and including things like recreation, sports, physical activities, all the different arts, STEM, and culturally focused programs. Those are the things. These, again, the service approaches could be a standalone programs that offer these things, offer classes and activities, or they could be enrichment opportunities that are embedded in summer services or after-school programs that offer a wide range of things. These activities that are listed here are the ones that were the top, most mentioned in all three strands of input. And the focus group input specifically noted STEM programming. I think that is an area that many folks have noticed we need more of, and that the levy's not done necessarily a lot to fund. So that's after school. Any questions?
Compared to last time, because I wasn't here in the 2014, 2019, you had new Sun Schools, Sun School communities as a program area strategy, which was very, very specific. Why this time around, just out of curiosity, much more robust offerings, which I'm supportive of, I want to be clear, because the last time around you were so specific, and so that's why I was just asking more for historical reference.
I mean, I think that's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to why that didn't come up. It just did not come up. I mean, because we asked, we gave providers, for instance, they had, the provider survey was all open-ended. There were 100 different folks that responded to that. Focus groups, again, those are open-ended discussions, and that specific type of service was not raised. And it may well be because the county has really expanded the system in the last 6 years, to cover a good many schools. I think there's probably 70 schools now, or maybe even more. Is it 80? I
I don't know the
that
exact number, but I do know that a couple budget seasons ago, we funded the last school that had like high rates of poverty that didn't have a SUN program. So we've tried to be as comprehensive and coverage, as much coverage as possible with that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that was my assumption, is that it has fanned out in the subsequent years to be pretty much covered. I mean, I think a SUN program could be included. I mean, they do these things, so I don't think it would not exclude a SUN program from, these strategies, as you pointed out, Felicia, are broader. And I think that was what the input that we got, is that we should be more broad.
It was the only program area in the last levy that was so specific, so that's why I was asking. There was no other really specific program in last round strategy, so that's why I was asking.
Yeah, there were intensive academic support was something we heard. Again, we talked to different people, and I think that we talked more to stakeholder groups who are more policy oriented, and that may be partly why. So there were folks who are in the field more, shall we say, rather than community members who are thinking more broadly or about their own child's experiences. So that may have had something to do with it. There were providers, were a big group that was consulted last time. They had a larger voice. I say larger than just community members who aren't maybe attached or with a particular provider. They might be using a range of services, some that we fund, some that we don't. So that could be it, but I don't really know why. Okay, now let me talk.
Right, mentoring.
Very simple slide.
A lot of what came up in the community engagement for mentoring echoed many of the themes that were in after school. So there's a lot of similarities actually in this strategy and program area in some ways to the first strategy in the after school program area. With mentoring, there was emphasis on serving youth populations, and so this is a feature marginalized by the public education system and who need support staying connected to and successful in that system. So that includes youth of color, youth who identify as immigrant or refugee, youth who have a disability or who identify as LGBTQ+. Again, features that came out strongly features that we want to see in mentoring programs and that came out strongly in community engagement include family and youth voice and engagement and leadership and identifying their needs and solutions to meeting their needs. PCL is looking for primarily paid staff whose job focuses on and emphasizes the mentoring role, who are experienced, trained, and share an identity with the youth that they serve or speak the home language. Low adult-youth ratios came up in community engagement, so that's a feature that we want to assure individualized support for youth in these programs and for youth and adults to build meaningful relationships over time. And we want to see programs that have commitment to ongoing staff training and development, particularly on the importance of culture in mentoring relationships. So the two possible service approaches for this one strategy of supporting youth academic success and positive development is either individualized or group mentoring that focuses on supporting youth to stay successful in school, where the mentor serves as a deliberate liaison between the child and family and the school and teacher and supports their academic success, and/or supports the youth in positive youth development and the youth's own goals for careers, healthy relationships and behavior, or their areas of interest, such as art, music, and science. So the rationale for this program area, as you've heard, in all of them, strongly from community engagement, were themes around mentors being needed to support youth's academic success and their positive behavior, their relationships, and the ability for them to experience new things under the guidance and support of a caring adult. For this particular strategy, PCL staff are recommending that programs primarily focus on paid staff in a mentoring role as opposed to relying on volunteer mentors. Because of the strong feedback in community engagement to support quality and that there is a consistent supply of mentors who share an identity with the youth and who can support the program and the youth over time and are able to accomplish the goals of the strategy, it was important for PCL staff to justify that these programs really rely on paid staff to accomplish these things. Not to say they couldn't include volunteer mentors, but we don't want that to be the emphasis necessarily of the program because of the considerations of the particular populations that we're looking to serve. The other rationale here, the recommendations, they mirror a national movement toward a practice called critical mentoring that's advanced by the Center for Critical Mentoring, which really centers culture as a driver of a mentee's learning and the mentor-mentee relationship. And then we looked also to best practices in mentoring that have been developed over time and are supported for this type of strategy, including looking at the social emotional development of youth, as Lisa indicated, and supporting their academic success. And then finally, local data that we compiled indicated what we heard from community engagement, which were the populations identified in this strategy are experiencing disproportionate barriers to school success, such as homelessness, bullying, poverty, and on average lower rates of academic achievement and positive youth development. Questions on mentoring?
Okay. On to hunger relief. So features that we would be looking to invest in for hunger relief programs that are somewhat unique to this area and what came back in public input. We would be looking for programs that conduct significant outreach to improve awareness of resources. That was something that was really noticeable in this program area, was people don't know what's out there. So to your point and your point earlier, ways to meet basic needs that people are not aware of, so or don't maybe have access to for one reason or another. So that's important. To employ strategies to reduce stigmatization for people who are accessing services. That was another big theme in this area, which was not necessarily didn't come up in other areas. We want programs that are demonstrably responsive to community needs and preferences on location for access, hours of operation, and culturally appropriate foods. So those are particular access barriers that were noted in this area. Fourth, programs that have and use nutrition or quality standards to screen the food distributed to children and their families. That was another big thing from focus groups. Did you have a question? Oh,
No.
No, okay, sorry, you look like you. And then last, provides fresh perishable foods, including fruits, vegetables, dairy, eggs, and meats. So the types of foods available and the fact that they're healthy and nutritious is important. First strategy would be to provide food for pickup by families at a variety of community locations, including schools. Possible service approaches include distribution at community-based locations such as churches, schools, parks, and other organizations that serve children and families, and distribution methods such as food pantries and fresh food markets that allow people to come in and choose foods. Also pre-prepared food boxes that some pantries offer, and backpacks that are filled with non-perishable foods that sometimes are given to students to take home on the weekend. The rationale for this was that community and school-based food distribution was prioritized across all strands of input as the best way to provide healthy, nutritious food to children and caregivers. And there's strong support for monitoring the quality of the food that you're giving people for health outcomes. So there's good research on that as well, and is intuitive to boot. Second strategy is to provide mobile food banks or pantries or home delivery of food to children and families experiencing food insecurity. This was a theme in the focus group input, and overall, transportation to food resources, be they grocery stores or no-cost pantries or folks offering free food resources of various types, was the most significant strand, or most significant barrier noted in all strands of input. As I said, need for mobile services was a theme in focus groups, and also transportation. We currently fund one mobile service delivery. That is, and they survey their participants every year, and they ask for the barrier that is, what is the barrier that you're experiencing that makes you take advantage of this service? And transportation is the number one barrier. So I think that is really coming through loud and clear, that it's a significant issue to be, and if you're hauling kids and you're on a public transportation, you've got groceries and other children to mind, it's a significant barrier to making use of these resources that are out there. So I think we need to be thinking about some way to address that. The other thing is, I think that mobile services could address the hours of operation issues and convenient location issues. So, a different way to make resources available, trying to triangulate for people. So third strategy is to provide training and education on things like nutrition, cooking, food budgeting, smart shopping, information about how to access local food resources, gardening for food production, community gardening resources that exist in our community, and providing them to children and caregivers. That was a theme across these types of education and training efforts, was a theme across all strands of input. In general, there's good research that shows food insecure families eat less nutritious diets because low-cost foods are often calorie dense and nutrition poor. And education on food selection and nutrition and budgeting has been shown to decrease food insecurity and improve health outcomes. So you've got good research as well as what folks are consistently saying behind that. Any questions on hunger relief strategies? Okay. Do you want to see if anybody wants to give input? Because there are changes, as Felicia noted, there are changes between the strategies that came out of this community engagement to what was before.
I'd like to ask one question before
Sure.
we do that. Thinking about a couple of these things, mentorship, access to food resources. To what degree do we think about intergenerational support? Going back to the work that we did at the county years ago, and Jeff was very actively engaged with her Vital Aging Task Force in 2008, 2009, thinking about pairing the needs of young people with the needs of older adults, and thinking about the importance of older adults participating in that mentoring process and the value it not only brings to youth, but the value it brings to older adults in terms of better health outcomes and better overall view towards life. And then I'm thinking about the transportation issue. It may be really hard, and I'm just envisioning, you laid out a perfect vision there of a single mom, kids, groceries, bus. And I can totally see why that would be an untenable situation, but I'm sure there are also volunteers who might be willing to do that for that mother and her family. And there's an opportunity there for community engagement for somebody who's maybe a retiree or an older adult who is still able to make that transportation link happen. And I'm wondering, to what degree do we think about connecting those dots?
That's a good question. They're not specifically connected here. I think that this strategy would allow for that type of approach to be used. And essentially, I think Meals on Wheels, the service that we're currently the only one we're funding right now that involves a mobile kind of offering like that, does use volunteers, some of whom are retirees, some of whom are older adults as well. Although I don't know that it's intentional. I think, they're using volunteers I think they can get. I'm not sure that they're specifically looking for a type of volunteer. So yeah, I think, I'm not sure, would you be looking to sort of specifically call that out? Or just more, have we thought about it?
I think it is something we should call out. We think about the levy being focused narrowly on service providers towards youth, but I'm thinking we can think a little more broadly about that and think about other programs or services that benefit youth, but maybe we don't start by thinking of them as youth-oriented programs per se. And there might be a partnership here with the City of Portland as we move our age-friendly business in-house during this next budget cycle. I'll certainly think about it and think about whether there's some leveraging opportunities to be had there.
Okay, that sounds, I mean, that sounds interesting. I don't know as much about that world, so I'd be curious to see how we could connect.
I would be curious to hear providers give some insight about that too. I think my first thought about it is about the training of volunteers and just what a major production that is, and to get them to show up and really engage in the training. And when I think about older adults working with young people in the mentoring arena, I think about older adults who have time and capacity for mentoring being largely white and more affluent, and kids who are whose families are seeking mentors for them being younger and of color, and that there being oftentimes a cultural mismatch there in ways that have made the training difficult for the mentor to really take on and for the relationship to build. So I would want us to be looking to programs for some insight about that. And also, since the community engagement results in mentoring highlighted so much the desire for families and children to have mentors that that kids can see themselves in. I have like other concerns about kind of what that older adult paired with a younger mentee looks like. But I would be happy to hear what folks in this room have to say about that.
I think it's different in different program areas. I mean, volunteers, it can be used in a variety of different ways. I think in mentoring, that would be a concern. I'm not sure that being a mobile food deliverer would necessarily not work, potentially to be older adults for that. So in other words, I think the role matters to some extent.
Great, public testimony.
Before we go shuffle about.
Are we really going to go through this whole meeting and have no public testimony?
Just one person. Just come on.
Even if you want to come and talk about the 211 experience that was brought up earlier.
Right, yeah, the difficulty.
Here comes somebody.
Yes.
Bravo. Yay.
Yay. Thank you.
Not planned at all. Just so everyone knows.
Spontaneous is good. Welcome, thank you for being
Hi.
here.
Good morning. Good afternoon. My name is Bree Condon. I'm the new executive director at Bradley Angle. I have 3.5 days under my belt. Previously, I've spent a good long time, over a decade, working in foster care, collaboratively with DHS, not internally. And I just wanted to add just some information about trauma. To your point about the little blue booklets that we have for resources going around the city. So, can I interact with the audience or just you all?
We're casual here.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, I'm just kidding. So I just want to maybe start just like a quick brainstorm so that folks on the other side of that table there can take a look at how trauma affects accessibility to resources. So it's great that we have that 211 resource book because everything is listed there, right? If I'm experiencing homelessness, I know where to go. I know who to call. So it's not necessarily about, is the information accessible? I think that's one point. But everything we're talking about today is, there's a variety of complexity involved in how people experience being born into this world and maybe being born into a family of poverty. Maybe certain kids are experiencing child welfare involvement. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're experiencing, they've been hungry for years, and so now they're having health problems. Substance abuse, mental health issues, childhood trauma that's unaddressed or misaddressed. But to pair with, is the resource accessible to our community members is very important. But equally, I just want to give voice to something that wasn't given voice to earlier, which is that someone's experience with trauma can make a resource in a booklet completely inaccessible. And it's not something that we think about day to day. I think about it because I'm involved in the work, and maybe folks here, maybe by a show of head shaking, yes or no, maybe you're with me on this. So I just want to say, trauma, to your point, Mayor, intergenerational, have we looked at how things affect generations behind us and in front of us? And that's really important also when we're looking at trauma. There was a study done, and I'm sure someone in this room knows a little bit more about it than me, but Holocaust survivors, their great-grandparents, their grandparents, their grandchildren in front of them, that's actually passed down in DNA. So when we're talking about how can we help make resources more accessible, I think it's really important to understand what trauma does to something that might be easily accessible for me. Getting on a bus to pick up food, at Bradley Angle or another nonprofit or a for-profit in the area, that might be relatively easy for me. Getting on a bus to someone who's been sexually violated on a city bus in Portland, there's no way without support or a paid advocate or a paid mentor and potentially years of clinical work and empowerment inducing strategies that someone would be able to get on a City of Portland bus that sounds a certain way, smells a certain way, looks a certain way, feels a certain way when they're sitting in that seat, and go get that food box. Those are two very different things. So I think the more that the City of Portland can continue to fund to the greatest ability that's possible year to year, services that really do work on addressing intergenerational trauma, from looking at what's happened to elders behind an individual and what's happened and what's the potential for success in future generations, I think is critical. So I just wanted to give voice to that.
Thank you.
I don't know how to end my little
That
chat.
was perfect.
Bree, are you new to the community?
No, sir. I helped co-build all the foster care programs under New Avenues for Youth.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I've been a business consultant working with lots of different social service agencies statewide and now across the country, and now I'm back to Portland, so
We're very lucky to have you here,
Yes,
and
we
so
are.
is Bradley Engel. Thank you.
thank you.
Really appreciate it. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you again. All right, that completes our substantial public testimony period. Lisa, is there anything specific that you wanted us, you're coming back then next month with the second draft,
Well, I
is
guess
that correct?
If there's any specific direction from you all to think through any,
Mitch had, I guess, a couple of questions.
So first, thanks for all the really good work. I really appreciated it. I think we're definitely on the right track. As I have a couple suggestions or requests, and I'm looking at on page 3, where you've got a 2-column chart. And as much as I hate to do this, I'm going to suggest a couple more columns. But first, what I'd like to do, since those are strategies from the prior to current strategies, can we line those up so that, I mean, for instance, if you look at after school, the first one up in 14-19 years, intensive academic support. The first bullet is in the current one, provide academic support and tutoring. The second one is enrichment programming, but that's the last bullet on the right. So if we could, and what I'm getting at is, I'd like to line them up and then understand the language difference. So in early childhood, the second box is preschool, Head Start, or structural preschool-like experiences for 3 to 5-year-olds. The first bullet for the current one is provide affordable, high-quality preschool. What's the difference from a significant standpoint? Is it just different language, or is there more to it than that? I think we also need to include the key elements of the features, because those are just as important, the way we've gone about our work, as the strategies. So it seems like we ought to look at, what were the key features before and what are the key features now. I'm just trying to drive to what is it that we're changing. It isn't just words. So what are the key?
we didn't have key features before. So I would
So-
say that was partly a result of the fact that so much of the input that came through was more about how services are delivered and than they were necessarily about what service. So as Kiyoshi said last time, the what has not changed dramatically. There's some changes, but not hugely. But more the how, with more attention on the how.
That's a tough distinction. I mean, we keep talking about broadening out, which I think is a good thing. But it's going to mean that it's going to be harder to grade, right? We're going to get more, theoretically, we can get more proposals because we have a broader, well, I guess I'm asking, do we have a broader, are we identifying a broader range or delivery options? So it's, all I'm saying is, can we try to get it on the page?
Okay.
And so we see, because I honestly, and I tried to go back and read our, what was underneath the strategies from the last levy period and this one, and there's a lot of common language, so I don't know if it's just kind of restating, are we generally in the same ballpark we were last time, or is this a fairly dramatic shift? And I'm just trying to identify the fairly dramatic shifts.
Okay, so you want something that kind of outlines what's changed, what's the same?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you
that.
could line them up by similar strategy, obviously there's some new strategies that weren't in the old ones, but like I said, some of these read almost the same, just different words. Some of them are longer, some of them are shorter, but they use mostly the same words. What does that really mean? So if you wouldn't mind doing that.
Okay.
And then, you and I talked about this earlier, we're going to go out to current grantees and the broader community. If when we see it again, if we have a column that has that significant input, if there's 100 significant inputs, I get that, we're just going to have to get it separately, but if we have repeated statements in these categories referring to the strategies, I think that would be really helpful to see how the community responded. So,
And I would say, I don't know that we'll get huge amounts of response, because a lot of people just participated in the community engagement. I mean,
Yeah.
we'll put it out there for sure, but I just want you to, given the last, little survey we did, I'm not sure surveys, I mean, we'll try some
Right.
different methods and see if we can figure out some different ways, but I'm not sure you'll get casts of, there won't be hundreds of replies probably, is my guess, because a lot of folks came and joined in that process when Kiyoshi was running it. So, particularly around the strategies, because those are coming out of community engagement in particular.
right.
So,
But
but we can add it in, yes.
yeah,
I'm just wanted to
I
modify.
have a
wanted to-
feeling that our current
yeah.
grantees might be very interested in this, because this is the first time where we're really trying to lay out, it used to be like this, now it's like this. And so that'll be, if we don't hear from them, my guess is they're thinking that everybody's thinking we're on the right track and good for us. And if we do, then we'll deal with that when we get it.
Okay, we can organize the input that way if that's helpful.
I mean, just speaking for me, that would make it easier.
For me, as a newer member of the levy, and I see this as taxpayers' dollars, I see strategies, but it would be nice to see outcomes attached to the 2014, 2019, and what we want to see as outcomes for the 2025. Because I seeing strategies without a goal around outcomes is really difficult for me. And I'll give you a clear example of what I mean. On the Board of All Hands Raised, for example, we wanted to raise the rate of FAFSA completions in high school. So we are always looking at that dial. Are we making an impact in that? And what the young woman said that was from Bradley Engelhouse ED, I just think that working with all of our providers, I think there is this obligation for us to move the dial in serving marginalized communities. So I just want to make sure that when looking at all of these priority areas and who we work with, are we actually moving the dials? Are these strategies also leading to outcomes where we're actually making some sort of dent or difference? Because I think the mayor brings up a good point, like, if it makes you feel any better, Mayor, I don't know 211 very well either, and I've been working in nonprofit for over 2.5 decades. But I just want to make sure, because I see the strategies, but I'm like, well, these are great, but from the last time around, I don't know what the outcomes were with the people. I mean, I know I looked at seeing what they got as grant allocations and what they served, but I don't know if those outcomes led to moving the dials in the areas that we're trying to address. So this time around, it would just be nice, thinking along what Mitch is saying, to really look not just only at strategies, but the outcomes and the outputs as well in the future.
Okay, we can, I mean, that gets a little bit tricky. It gets a
I
little bit
figure.
complicated because
Yeah.
we fund member services that are across a wide age range, and we fund many different kinds of services that achieve many different kinds of outcomes. For when, I mean, our programs are measuring outcomes for when the child is in, or parent is in the service. They don't have the capacity or the ability to measure the outcome down the line. So, like, for instance, some of the people that were featured in the community report this year, we talked about someone who went to Albina Early Head Start and Head Start and is now, a junior in high school. And so looking at his trajectory and how his support help provide a good foundation for him. But that program is not tracking and reporting on what happened to that child down the line. So in terms of moving the dial for people in the sort of at that community-wide in the longitudinal sense, that part we don't have. we can certainly provide you outcome data that relates to the strategies, if that makes, if that's helpful.
Yeah, so let me give another very specific example. One of the things you guys talked about, how we don't have provider representation in certain areas, right, of areas of focus. That was, you wanted culturally specific providers in certain areas. I think that's something we can actually measure. So we don't have so many, for example, childcare providers that serve grades 3 to 5 that are African American or Latino or something. Are we making that movement in funding the levy to make sure more of these mentors or childcare providers or any of those things are from those communities? Because I heard that through every priority area, for example. I'm just looking for ways to hold ourselves as the levy accountable for what the community actually asked us for. And I think, to me, as a member of this allocation committee, I want to honor the people that have put in their time into the levies by giving us input. So those are some of the examples I can give you. Not like the actual young people, but more of the examples of the change that they want to see, like you guys, like being more culturally responsive, or service areas. Are we making those sorts of changes within the industry? I hope that makes more sense.
It makes sense. I'm trying to conceive of how to represent it in a way that honors the complexity of the different types of services that providers propose. Everything from, I'm going to serve 30 families in home visiting twice a week, to I'm going to operate a full-day Head Start program most of the school year for this particular population, to I'm going to do an 8-week after-school science class. So I'm trying to figure out how to kind of put that together in a form like Mitch just outlined, like a table. And
I wouldn't need it in a table. I just want to know, for me personally, we went out to community for hours and hours and asked for recommendation. I think we do ourselves a disservice if we can't honor it in some way, is what I'm saying. So if they're asking for us to hire culturally specific people for very specific priority areas, or they're asking for mobility and hunger relief, whatever it is, we should start measuring it instead of giving it lip service, is what I'm saying. Yes. For me personally, as a levy committee member, is I want to make sure if the community has asked for very specific things over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 priority areas, there must be something that they're telling us that they're not seeing if it's constantly a priority. So I'm saying, the next time around in 5 years, we can say, you said this was a priority. We have been able to track that priority, whatever it is. And it doesn't have to be the kids, because I agree with you, Lisa. You can't track somebody from Head Start and they're going to be like a junior in high school. But I do think there is other things that we can track. Are the organizations we're funding making sure they're having service providers that are representative of what the community asks? That we can track.
Yes.
We can track that from beginning to end. I'm saying things like that we can actually measure. Let's measure it so when we go back to the community, we actually are doing what we said we're doing. Your feedback matters, therefore we're tracking it.
I see where you're going.
I hear you,
I think we can do that.
I think you'll see some of that hopefully reflected in the
Next
proposed
thing,
RFI or the request for investment redraft that's on this agenda too. And I think that, Felicia, your points about sort of how we ask providers about the nature of how they're going to accomplish their work and the specific examples that you provided are in there, and then how do we keep following up on that and report back? So I hear you.
That's it.
Yes.
And that's
Thank you.
something we haven't done. I think that's something we could do,
Okay.
so.
If we get those questions we ask the first time right. So we'll be looking to you to, all of you to help
But I think
us.
that tracking over time is a good point. We haven't done that, and I think we could do that.
Okay.
Very good. So draft 2 comes back at the next meeting, is that correct?
Put it out widely for comment.
Okay, very good. Anything else on
try
this
some different
subject before we move to the next? All right, great, thank you. Our last item centers around potential changes to the public testimony process during funding rounds. When the
Not there yet.
allocation. Did I skip something? What did I
We've
skip?
got a section of
Oh, you're
the-
right, the whole thing about RFI.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is the funding application.
This is actually a good one. I'm sorry I skipped right over it. A lot of people.
You're just dying to get to that, aren't you? I can tell.
No, never. Our next item is actually stepping back a bit around proposed revisions to the RFI. And Meg, you're going to walk us through some of these changes, is that correct?
Do my best, yep.
Very good. Then we'll take public comment on this item as well. And then if there are changes or revisions, you'll also bring this back next month.
That's correct.
I appreciate it.
Yes.
Go for it, Meg.
Yes, all right. So in preparing for our grant making, we are putting together the request for investment template, which is something that we do in advance of each funding process so that you all get a chance to look at the types of questions that we ask of applicants and the score value that we'd like to use and the criteria, and get public input as well about all of that, refine it, and then kind of come back with a final draft that then gets put into forms for each program area. So this is part of that process. We're debuting a revised request for investment section that's focusing on organizational capacity and their commitment to racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I'll walk you through the specifics and how we arrived there in a little bit. After today's presentation of this information, it'll go out also to the public for their consideration. So folks here also have a paper document that outlines what you all saw in terms of the revisions and the proposed revised scoring criteria and the point values. And all of our old requests for investment documents are available on our website at www.portlandchildrenslevy.org. So if anyone wants to go and dig into those too for finer detail, they can. And then after you all look at it today and we hear more feedback, we'll incorporate that, we'll refine it. We will bring to you additional sections for your consideration at the June 3rd meeting, and we'll hope to have a finalized version by your meeting on the 17th so that we as staff can begin to work on creating each program area RFI for publication this fall. So with that, we'll focus on today's section. And it is revised to respond to and reflect recommendations that Portland State University's team gave us in their grant-making process review that they did for us. So it echoes that, and it also is intended to echo the Levy-wide themes from the community engagement process, which asked us to be much more intentional and focused around organizational practices and results related to racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. We talked to other funders who are our peers who have also been undertaking major grant-making work in this area and looking very intentionally at how they ask questions and what they ask and how they think about it. So we looked to Meyer Memorial Trust, Collins Foundation, Metro, particularly their Parks and Nature team, Early Learning, Multnomah at United Way, and then we also reached out to the Oakland Fund for Children and Youth that have a similar children's levy to ours. We also looked at local RFPs from Multnomah County Healthy Families, Northwest Health Foundation, and the San Francisco Foundation. In addition, we consulted with the city's Office of Equity and Human Rights, and they've agreed to provide us some review and feedback on our RFI as we go along, which they did last time as well, although the staff has changed there. So in order for you to understand where we are now, I'm going to walk through where we were before. So in 2014, our previous RFI, there were 4 sections. There was one on proven program design and effectiveness worth 55 points, and folks had to get a minimum of 39 to be considered for funding. There was a budget section worth 10 points. There was an organizational capacity section worth 10 points. And there was a culturally responsive programs and organizations section worth 25 points and a minimum of 16 to be considered for funding. And then there were bonus points available to applicants who proposed serving a majority of clients who reside or attend school in 6 of the East Portland zip codes, or who were programs or organizations that demonstrated that they were culturally specific. The previous RFI organizational capacity section did not ask questions related to racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. It focused specifically on the organization's mission, strategic plans, and leadership, while the culturally responsive programs section focused on the definition of culturally specific programs and asked people to respond to that. It asked for the demographics of client, staff, and board for the applicant organization, and it asked other questions around organizational commitment to cultural responsiveness, service user voice and influence, community engagement and collaboration, staff recruitment, retention, promotion, training, including board training and language accessibility of program services. In the new draft that is before you and in the audience today, staff has collapsed those two previous organizational capacity and cultural responsive program sections into one larger section that looks at the organizational capacity of the organization and its approach to racial equity, diversity, and inclusion as an organization. The one new section is proposed to be worth 36 points with a minimum of 23 points to be considered for funding. The draft for that section, along with the scoring criteria and proposed point values for that, is available for everybody. So we're putting those out alongside each other to be transparent so that people can see both what would be asked of an applicant and how reviewers would be asked to look at their answers and score. And then we will bring, like I said, the program section and the budget section to you at a later date. The new organizational capacity and commitment to racial equity, diversity, and inclusion section reflects many of the topic areas that were in the two sections previously, but has tried to make them a bit more focused and intentional. Some of the scoring criteria have changed and been refined, and overall, the intent of the new section is to award higher points to organizations that demonstrate a deep, ongoing commitment to and success in advancing racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. The section moves away from awarding bonus points, the 3 bonus points for being a culturally specific organization, and instead tries to shift a greater amount of points to organizations who demonstrate long-term successful commitment to racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. The rationale for these changes include aligning the section with the citywide equity goals. The city has 3 equity goals, and we wanted to assure that our work is advancing those goals by incorporating it into our grant-making process, in our community engagement process, and in our internal staff operations. I just want to say, for a point of transparency, staff readily acknowledges that we lack in racial diversity on our staff, but we do strive toward cultural humility and responsiveness. In addition to making the changes in our grant-making process that we've outlined here, we have created an affirmative action plan, and we are in the process of creating an equity plan using the tools and resources available to us through the Office of Equity and Human Rights. In addition to aligning with the citywide equity goals, this section revision intends to honor PSU's recommendations of awarding more points to applicant organizations with greater commitment, experience, and results in racial equity, diversity, and inclusion, and whose clients, staff, and board reflect majority of color. As I said, we've eliminated the focus on cultural specificity and those bonus points, which is not what PSU recommended, but we tried to honor what they were recommending by moving more points into this section and awarding more points for greater evidence of that work. We did incorporate their advice to define as a standard for reflectiveness of the board and staff reflecting the clients that they serve as all being majority of color. So that 51% or more of the clients served by the organization are of color, and that the board and staff are as well. The third rationale for this is, like I said, to reflect the community engagement recommendations. As we've already talked about today, there was very strong preference that we do a better job in that arena. So this is our attempt to approach this, for this part of the RFI, how to do that better of what we ask of applicant organizations. We have other questions that we'll be looking at about how we ask that of the specific program being proposed, and that'll come at the next meeting. Like I said, we did talk to other funders to look at how they're approaching this work. We looked both at how they ask questions about and understand the reflectiveness of the staff and board compared to clients being served. And we heard a lot about how they're thinking about how service providers really involve the communities that they serve in the work that they do, and how they hold themselves as organizations and service providers accountable to the communities that they serve. So this, the revisions in this section try to get at questions to help us understand that. And I shouldn't just say us, because again, there will be reviewers who read and score this, and that's a whole other topic you'll hear about at a later date. Most of the funders that we talked to weren't necessarily focused on the cultural specificity of a program or organization, but also were moving in a direction of trying to understand an organization's commitment to racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. And then finally, we took a look at the point spread in the applications that we got in the 2014 process. So in 2014, 91% of the applications had a score of 8 out of a total of 10 in that organizational capacity section that we had before. Of the few organizations that scored 7 or less, 6 of them were organizations that the levy was already funding. So what that told us is that section, the way it was set up before, and the points that were there did little to influence the ultimate score of the application. On the other side of that, the section that we had on culturally responsive programs and organizations, there was a greater spread. About 70% of the applications scored 19 or higher, while 12 applications were eliminated from funding consideration entirely because they didn't reach the minimum score. So this revised section of the RFI, again, moves toward trying to give reviewers a greater chance for discernment in scores across the questions being asked in there, while still getting a sense of organizational capacity, but trying to really understand how well the organization is advancing toward racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. So that is the presentation of this. And I am happy to answer questions, and we are happy to answer questions, and happy to hear public testimony.
So I had a question. It's a little bit related to this and a little bit related to what we were just discussing. So I appreciate the changes to the RFI section and looking at how kind of structurally we can uplift DEI, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the work that we're doing. When I was looking at the draft strategies, these are specific depending on the different program areas, but I was also looking at the overall levy goals and then the different program goals. And I know the investment areas are set, in statute, and that's what people voted on in the levy. But are the goals for the program and the goals for the program areas also in statute, or are those things that we also have influence on?
That's a great question.
The overall goals are in the statute, in the rule, or the act that accompanies the passing of the levy. The program area goals are not in that, so those could be malleable.
Because there isn't, there is the racial and ethnic disparities, but we don't call them out specifically within the program area goals, and
Correct.
that's something that I think we might want to take a look at doing.
Right, and toward Felicia's point too, like how are we gonna hold ourselves accountable to what people have asked us to do?
And we don't have to duplicate the work. We could, since you're working with other funders, you can use OCF's. Oregon Community Foundation has a whole report around the racial disparities and how to use that as well. So I don't want, because we're so limited staff-wise, I think the collaboration, which I hear that you use for this, would be great to use in using that sort of framework.
Thank you.
And do we even have, and I don't know if this is something that you guys have through the kind of work that you've already done, and maybe this is in the report and I just haven't seen it, but even just setting the baseline of where we are in the 6 different program areas, like a snapshot of the state of, children in Portland, for instance, just to kind of say, where are we talking, what's the baseline of where we are today?
Yeah, that's what's in that local data report.
That is, okay, yeah,
That's
that
pretty
is.
much, that is like kind of, okay, here's all the,
Okay.
it's really boring to present that, so we have not brought that to you because it is just number after number after number. So I would, I can send that to you again, but that will give you kind of where that sits, and it just, like I said, it could be your bedtime reading because it will help you
Okay.
go to sleep with the number of stats.
A couple of things. I thought this was excellent work, you guys. Thanks for talking to the community. I think this is really good stuff. I got a couple of nits on the proposed Exhibit B and then a couple of questions on the scoring. In Section F, we say, describe how the organization engages in authentically and collaborative with community leaders. It seems to me the authentic part is what's going to get scored, so I would drop that word. Just,
Drop it because,
well, if it's not authentic, then it doesn't get scored well. Is it authentically, whether it is or isn't, is going to be scored, right? They're going to tell us how they collaborate with community leaders, and we'll decide whether it's authentic or not,
okay.
right? I didn't get the point of that. Anyway, number H, first of all, you've got served twice in the first bullet, but
Thanks.
in the first bullet, you've got a reference to demographic data, but not in the rest of them. But I'm pretty sure we want the demographic data in all of them.
Say it again, I'm sorry, I misheard.
We reference corresponding demographic data in the first bullet under H.
Yep.
But not under the remaining bullets, but we want the demographic data, don't we? I mean, we want to know,
Yes. Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
table that they'll be.
I assume that, but
Yeah.
I just would suggest we're consistent, either mentioning it in every one of these or none of them, because we want it in all of them.
I see what you're saying. The phrasing, the
Yeah.
corresponding demographic data, okay. Yes,
Does that make
I
sense?
see what you're saying. In other words, in all three of the or in all of the subsequent bullets, it's saying, give us the number, as opposed to also saying, yeah, thank you, got it.
And I thought the scoring was just, it's easy to follow, really well done. I like it. I'm totally supportive of it. My question is, I didn't see where we incorporated what we had under C, D, and E in the last section, which was key management turnover, financial administrative experience, and statement of experience, which was not scored, but was something we asked for.
Yes.
Has that been removed? Have those sections been removed, or are they someplace else?
Good question. We've talked about those. So in the old RFI, item D was about financial and administrative experience. We've talked internally about moving that to the budget section in order to help the budget section be something that reviewers can score, that doesn't just have the budget for the proposed program, but kind of takes into account how they think about whether the organization can manage that budget. The key management and staff turnover, and colleagues chime in, that information didn't tell us a lot last time in the organization, and reviewers, the way in which that section was scored, reviewers didn't do a lot with that information in a way that changed the results of their scoring, and it didn't necessarily affect whether you all selected an application for funding or not. And I guess we felt like there were probably other questions with higher utility that we needed to ask applicants that would hopefully yield us better information. We went back and forth on it, but at only a couple of points, it just didn't seem to really turn an application one way or another. And then in terms of the statement of experience, that it also was, we can certainly include it again, but it wasn't something, on average, most applicants who scored well enough to be considered for funding were ones that the community, the reviewers knew well, you all knew well. It didn't come into play as a very useful tool. And so in the interest of trying to eliminate how much information we ask applicants to produce and how much we ask reviewers to wade through, we tried to be a little bit more judicious about the things that seemed of higher priority to the community and might get us information that allowed reviewers to discern and differentiate scoring.
Makes sense. Question in the new section H, what's the difference between the first two bullet points? Other than you'll get I guess, an exact percentage, not just above 51 or below 51.
Yeah, I
Seems
mean,
like it was kind of the same question asked a different way, or?
I mean, it is and it isn't. I guess it's sort of like the first question allows reviewers to look at whether or not the way that the applicant fills out the entire demographic table and decide whether or not they believe it indicates that what the applicant has said on paper above seems to agree with how they present their numbers on paper. They get more additional opportunity for points based on how they meet these other thresholds.
And also, diversity and inclusion does potentially include other things besides racial equity, and I think that was partly our thinking behind
Okay.
at least that, that there is some, in other words, if the organization, I think we talked a little bit about this example, was serving lesbian, gay, trans,
Right.
LGBTQ plus, I should say, youth, is the organization, does their leadership reflect that particular variable? And that kind of comes more under
So
diversity and
that
inclusion.
you'd see it there. Oh, okay,
I
great,
mean, yeah,
great.
in a small way, yes.
And the last question, sorry to take up so much time, but in terms of the percentages here, clearly our bigger organizations will have a harder time hitting these numbers, getting over the 51%. If a big organization with lots of different programs, just by demographics and mathematics, are less likely to be able to reach the 51% just in terms of employees and, which is not a bad thing, right? We're trying to drive to a different provider, and so I think that's good. Did you guys consider maybe adding a question about program-specific, not overall employee, and maybe throw 1 point in there for organizations that, you know, aren't going to hit those other ones, those other markers?
We had a program-specific staff question before, and for a small program where there's 1 or 2 people and the program doesn't yet exist and they're projecting who they might hire, the giving points for that was a dicey prospect for the reviewers. So we decided instead to really highlight, and this came from PSU as well, and I think it's kind of reflecting what community engagement said, is we want to see priority for organizations that show that they are already doing it. So when they say they're going to operate a particular program a particular way, there's evidence that suggests they probably will and can.
That was the main reason.
Thank you.
Yep.
Very good. Public testimony on this item. Any thoughts from our service providers?
Come on, you guys.
All right, good. We'll assume that that's positive. If not, get us comments, please.
Find out another way.
I know not
Yes, we
everybody
will.
likes to testify in public, but if people have other thoughts, please do let us
We'll
know.
offer the written comment option.
Yeah, written comments is always a good thing, so please take advantage of that opportunity if you'd so like. And next up, this is our last item.
Yes, this is our
Yes.
last.
Around potential changes to the public testimony process during the funding rounds when the allocation committee's making its various decisions. And again, Meg is going to present some options to consider, and once again, the public can weigh in after the committee's asked whatever questions we may have of the staff. Thanks again, Meg.
Yes. So I'll give you a little background or remind you all kind of like, so the children's levy is a hybrid, a little bit of a hybrid process, right? Of a regular government annual or every few years budgeting process and an RFP process. In an annual or every couple of years budgeting process, an executive proposes a budget, a legislative body adopts it, there's multiple public meetings and work sessions, there's opportunities for public comment, and there's lobbying in which there are rules that dictate what can and can't happen in that setting. In an RFP process, public employees will follow procurement procedures, they'll issue an RFP with specific guidance around what they want to purchase. There's a review committee that evaluates and scores the proposals based on published criteria. Interviews, the top scoring proposers might get interviewed, the top scoring proposers are awarded, the evaluation committee can't communicate with the proposers and they can't have a conflict of interest with who proposes, and the proposers if proposers attempt to communicate with that evaluation committee, their application is pulled. So we're somewhere in between those two areas. We use a responsive grant-making procedure. We do publish, like we said, an RFP, but we call it an RFI. We do make our criteria for how applications will be scored known. We do recruit community reviewers and ask them to use those published criteria. Reviewers can't have a conflict of interest. Applicants can't contact the reviewers during the scoring process. And all of that information is used by you all to make decisions. And you all are a public body, so you are subject to public meeting law. We have to make sure that your meetings are publicly noticed, that they take place in a location where the public can attend, that the public is aware of the decisions that you're going to be made and informed about them, and they know about the information that you'll use to make the decisions. But the law does not say that that there has to be a public testimony option for this meeting. It's a public it's a public attendance law, not a public participation law. So with that in mind, and knowing that we do this grant-making process only about every 5 years. And so every 5 years, we have to kind of revisit how we've done it and improve it. And this time, we had the benefit of PSU's good thinking after talking to applicants, both those that had received funding and those who hadn't, other funders, individuals who had served in your chairs. They gave us some recommendations about this particular testimony part of the process, knowing that while you're a public body, you don't necessarily have to do the public testimony process. It's just good practice. So their recommendations around that were that we clarify public meeting law as it applies to these meetings. So we will talk a little bit about that. That we better communicate whatever testimony process you all land on to applicants. And then they recommended that we modify the testimony process in ways that allow potential applicants to get to know allocation committee members better prior to funding decisions. That's a difficult prospect, and we're not going to talk about that today. We are going to talk about the testimony piece. And that we allow 10-minute interviews with applicants in this process. So we'll talk a little bit about that recommendations. Yeah. Don't worry. What they discovered in their process, just to remind you, is that providers are generally dissatisfied with the testimony piece of this process. They felt like there was too little time allocated to speak, and I'll remind you all how we did it before in a little bit. People who needed interpretation in order to provide their testimony didn't feel like they were given adequate time. They perceived that allocation committee members had already made up their minds before funding decisions were made, and then they felt like the access to advocacy with allocation committee members was unfairly distributed. So we're not necessarily asking for decisions and recommendations, or we're not making recommendations and asking you to decide today, but we want to kind of walk you through some of our thinking about how to resolve some of these issues and how to handle some of their recommendations, and then kind of the options that we've floated in our office and wanted to bring to you all and to the public to consider. So first off, clarifying the public meeting law, that seems like a very easy and obvious thing going forward, so we will absolutely do that. We will be sure that we communicate kind of what public meeting law is and how this body is subject to it in our next RFI, at our bidders conference, in frequently asked question type communication on our website, and in emails to applicants throughout the process. We would include in that outline that there has to be a quorum of you all in order to make a decision, that the law doesn't require testimony, but whatever policy you adopt about how you're going to handle testimony is an ongoing piece of what we communicate out. So there are kind of two, you go to the next slide, please. There are two items for discussion and consideration today. One is the issue of oral testimony and kind of how to handle their recommendation about 10 minutes per applicant. And then one is about the advocacy that's permitted during the process. So to think about oral testimony, we internally thought about an option that aligns with how we handled recently the grant renewal process, which is to provide each applicant an opportunity for written testimony to you all. So in the past, we've never given an applicant an opportunity after staff recommendations come out to each provide in a certain kind of format, in a certain way, written testimony to you all about their application and their reaction to staff's funding recommendation. So in the recent renewal process that you all did in March, we had a summary of the proposal that we were and our recommendation, and then we gave a space on the form for grantees to write any responses that they had to that recommendation. So we are suggesting that one easy way to handle giving everybody an opportunity to provide some testimony, though it's not the oral piece, is to provide that written testimony option to you all that they can provide in writing in reaction to staff recommendations. For the oral testimony, one thing I want to do is kind of paint context. In the last application process in 2014, there were 115 applicants. The way it was structured before is that there was about 2 minutes of testimony provided to the applicants, and that was scheduled over 2 meetings, 4 total meetings, just for testimony. And separately from that, there were 2 meetings for decision-making. So one testimony meeting covered 3 program areas. The second testimony meeting covered the other 3 program areas, and then there's similarly for the decision-making meetings, there were 3 program areas for each, in each
I
decision-making
have a
meeting.
question.
Yes, Commissioner.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
I just, did every one of the 115 applicants testify?
Not everyone did, but a lot of them did.
But like the vast
A
majority?
lot of-
Okay.
Yes, yep. So if we assume a similar number of applicants for this round, which I think is a very safe assumption, and you gave everybody 10 minutes, that's 20 hours of meeting time or 10 2-hour meetings. I am going out on a limb to say.
Not including if we extend to the small grants program.
Well,
They're not going to be running at the same time, at least, but yes.
Okay.
yeah, small grants you'll handle in another year. We'll get this one done first. But knowing the difficulty of scheduling meetings and the increased time for decision-making to do so, I mean, that's just the testimony meetings. You'd also have to have the decision-making meetings. But given the difficulty of scheduling meetings, the amount of time that would request of you, and the dissatisfaction with the testimony process in the past, staff is hesitant to think about how to increase testimony to being 20 hours and 10 2-hour meetings. Another option that we considered is how to have you all attend either as individuals or in groups of 2 multiple testimony meetings. So scheduling multiple meetings in which testimony per applicant can be longer, but you all aren't having to attend each of those meetings. You're kind of taking them on as small teams or individually, and we would ask that each of you attend it for at least 2 program areas. The difficulty with that one is that it seems hard for you all to then communicate in an efficient and transparent way what you hear at those meetings to each other for your deliberations. Another option that you could consider is focused testimony. So if you recall, in our last renewal process meetings, you took testimony only from folks who disagreed with staff's funding recommendations. If you wanted to look at it like that, in thinking about the previous process, just over half of the applicants of those 115 were not recommended for funding. So with about 55 applicants to testify, if you gave everyone 10 minutes each, that would be about 10 hours. And if you gave everybody 5 minutes each, that would be about 5 hours of meeting time for just testimony. One consideration that we had about that is that that does not give everybody a chance. And there still may be folks who feel like that isn't fair, and that's a reasonable argument to make. So that's the testimony options that we see at this point. Written testimony, for sure, we think that's a smart way to go. But we're not sure how to increase the amount of time available for testimony and so that folks feel like they get more time unless we think about either how to split up you all at individual meetings or focus testimony for certain reasons, either because staff didn't recommend an application for funding or it scored low and they want a chance to talk about their program despite the scoring. The other thing that you all need to decide is sort of around advocacy and how you want to handle advocacy from applicants. Whether you want to allow them to continue to reach out to individual allocation committee members throughout the process, and staff would do a better job notifying applicants about how that procedure can work, or whether you want to restrict advocacy to you all during the funding process. So that would not allow applicants to contact you all individually regarding their specific application during the process. You could adopt a policy about that, and they would not be able to approach you until decisions are made, other than in whatever testimony meeting and the written testimony we allowed. This would kind of address the complaints that PSU heard about unequal access to you all as individuals in the advocacy portion. It would also reduce the number of calls and emails that you get while the RFI is in process. So that's a lot. Happy to answer questions. Happy to hear what folks here have to say in the 5 minutes you have left.
I can't sit through 20 hours of testimony. it would be unfair to people because after I say the 15th person, I'm going to zone out. I'm just going to be honest. One recommendation I can have when thinking about the people that are applying for funding, I recently did a process for a national scholarship where we had, I felt like a bazillion young people, and we did videos. So each young person had to send us like a 5-minute video of why they deserved a scholarship, and I found that so useful because I didn't have to see them all at once. And each of us on the review committee, you're going to be shocked, had 250 each. And there was 14 of us on the review committee, so that shows you how many people applied. And then we had to rank the videos, so we had a ranking system, was it compelling, they gave us this little sheet. But I found it really helpful. We each got a Kindle, and we each got to watch it when we had time, and we had a 3-week process to get through all of them. I found that to be much more helpful than having to, I couldn't sit through hours. So that's a recommendation I can give you that some national scholarships are doing. And I mean, because, it's just, that's one recommendation I can give you. So.
Okay.
Thank you, Felicia.
Add that to the hopper of things to consider.
Yeah. So I mean, this is a big issue, and I kind of want to chew it over, but I appreciate all of the work that you went into putting this together. I mean, I think that, just in terms of some of the low-hanging fruit is, maybe limit the number of people per organization that can testify to even that playing field a little bit. And I definitely think that we should expand the time that's allowed for people who provide translation or interpretation services. I mean, I think that's one of those things that we want to take care of. I have to think a little bit more about the fact that we meet the definition of a governing body and then not having access to us during the process. I want to think about that a little bit more because there's something that doesn't sit quite right about it with me because we're not, I get that we're a hybrid of the governing body / kind of review process, but I want to think about that a little bit more. And then I do like the idea, though, of the written testimony. I think that's something that's really,
Yep.
like Felicia said, just give us a way as we're thinking through everything, have another piece of data. And then if we were to go to something that had, where it was only people who hadn't received a staff recommendation that were allowed to testify, I could see that being a little bit tricky because we based on that testimony, if we change our decision and maybe
Exactly.
drop out somebody who was recognized or recommended by staff, then shouldn't they also then get the chance to come back in and testify?
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
so that's a little bit tricky, but
Yeah, that
I
was
appreciate that, and we don't have to make the decision today. So
No.
so I
No,
think
you
it's a
don't.
lot to get a good amount of things to think through.
More to raise the issues
Yeah.
and have you all think about what you want out of this and what you think is going to be beneficial to the people who are applying in terms of them feeling that it's fair.
Yeah.
I'm strongly in favor of restricting access during the grant making. Just reading the emails that are sent is laborious in itself, just to make sure there isn't one of them that's in there that is critical to the proposal. Most of the time, it's just an invitation to some event or something like that, but you don't know that until you open it and read it. So getting through all those emails in and of themselves is a challenge. And I also am very sensitive to the access question. And the only way it can get fixed is there is no access. Because I don't see a viable way that we're going to create enough opportunities for organizations and folks that don't know us already to meet us and have a authentic conversation. So that would be one. I second the comments about having every applicant get your proposed outcomes and having every applicant be able to provide written testimony. I think that's super fair and important. And it's kind of funny that we've missed that opportunity. It's because it seems so obvious now that we talk about it. In terms of the testimony, I think it is not a question of length of time. It's a question of the structure. And I don't think people are going to feel more fulfilled if we increase 3 minutes to 5 minutes or 5 minutes to 10 minutes. The structure is the frustration. It's a frustration for us on this side of the table, and I'm absolutely convinced it's a frustration on the other side of the table. So as much as it kind of makes me feel good to say, well, let's give them more time, I don't think the frustration level will change. So I would just I'd love to find a silver bullet in there somewhere, but I don't know where it is.
We were hoping for one, too.
Yeah.
You get it
Mayor,
every
being a very busy person, what do you think?
There's two sides to this coin. Number one, there's the access side of the coin, and Felicia said it so that I didn't have to say it. Then there's the attention span side of the coin, and how much public testimony you can actually absorb. And I'll just speak for myself because I have no scientific data. Public testimony that comes early tends to be more engaging. People tend to be more clued in. They tend to ask more questions. And then you watch the morning or the afternoon plot on, and the engagement level, the attention span, the questions tend to drop off. So I've always felt that if you testified early, it was somehow more favorable than if you got to testify late. I think there's an inequality and an unfairness inherent to the public testimony process by virtue of the fact that we're all human and we have limited attention spans. I like the idea of somehow finding ways to level the playing field. And so I'm mindful of what Felicia said and what the commissioner said and what Mitch said with regard to let's figure out what we want and then make it uniform.
Yep.
So that if some people have
Right,
access, then everybody gets
Yes, yeah,
access.
yeah.
But if only a few people are going to get access, then let's just limit it and say nobody gets access. But let's create then some alternative platform, whether it's a web-based platform, whether it's a written document, whether it's a video, whatever it is, then let's be uniform about it. So at least people feel that everybody's getting the same fair shake. One last thing, I rely heavily on you as the highly competent professional staff to give us direction. And my expectation would be that most of the time, I would take your recommendation based on the due diligence and the hard work that you have already done, that you've already put into this based on a set of standards that you are clear about up front. So consistency and standards is really important for you as well. I was sort of smiling at the part getting to know us better. In this environment, that sounds really good. In other environments, I might not be quite as excited about that opportunity. There should be more of an interaction, and I personally just hope that I have the opportunity to visit with some of the EDs and go visit some of the organizations that I haven't yet had the opportunity to meet with on a one-off basis, but not necessarily associated with the funding cycle itself.
Well, many of you meet many of these grantees in
Sure.
other capacities, so I know
Sure.
that's the case. I guess, we also feel like the people who feel that they have limited access for whatever reason, don't cross paths, feel slighted in that, and I don't know how, I think you're right. We are absolutely committed to whatever it is, whatever we decide is an some kind of equal access.
Did PSU mention an appeals process?
Yes.
They did.
And where did that conversation go? I forgot where we ended that.
You voted against doing one.
Yeah.
Okay,
For-
and I could see why that would be the case with a pro forma funding
For
decision.
responsive grant-making where there's discretion involved in
Yeah.
the decision-making, where you all come together in a public meeting and make that decision over time, appeals processes are used in RFPs where it's cut and dried. There's a score, and you won the RFP or you didn't, and then you
Although
can apply.
for the record, I wouldn't actually mind receiving written comments after the fact. If an organization, for example, they feel that we have not accurately reflected what they're doing, or they feel that the judgment call on our part went away different than I would certainly be open to that feedback in writing. And
Okay.
then
That's a
that
different way to
could
do
be
it,
used
yeah.
for future conversations or discussions.
Well, I think the city council has to approve all of our actions, so there's essentially your appeals process right there.
You had to mention
So-
that, Mitch. Thank you so kindly. Thank you. And Mitch will be here for all of it.
Although they have to take the whole slate and reject
Or
the
he'll
whole slate.
disappear very quickly.
Those not quite appeals, because that's the city council has
I
the
know.
option to
I
either
know.
take it
I
or
was
leave it, but
very
not pick and choose, which would be more like
Yeah,
appeals.
and we just had that, and it is somewhat of a straitjacket, because it really is an all or nothing
Yeah.
proposition. It comes to the council as a package, and we either vote the package through or we don't vote the package through.
Yeah. It was meant to be like a gross miscarriage of justice standard kind of
Exactly,
thing.
exactly. Very good.
Okay, we're kind of past time.
Okay.
I guess we can try to solicit input. Does anybody really want to say something
Yeah.
today?
And anybody have any public comment? All right, and again, we'll take written comments on this.
And
Is that okay,
We'll
Lisa?
revisit these at the June
Sure.
3rd meeting for the second
Okay.
reading.
Very good, thank you all.
And we can try to
on-
come to a recommendation that takes these thoughts into account.
Okay, and I want to say this, I want to thank the staff for taking a lot of material and being very,
you.
very thoughtful and organized in how you present this material. The fact that we're able to get through all of this in 2 hours is actually remarkable. When I saw
Thank
the
you all
agenda.
for doing all the reading of the homework.
I wondered, so I know that it looked seamless, but I know behind the scenes that meant you guys put a lot of work into this, and I want to acknowledge that. We'll hear back from you then next month. Just a reminder, our next meeting is 2 to 4 p.m. Monday, June 3rd. That's 2 to 4 p.m. on June 3rd. And agendas, as always, will be sent to the Levy database and posted on the website. We stand adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good work, guys.